Welcome to our fourth lecture, where we'll be discussing the conclusion of Herman Melville's novella Billy Budd. Last time, we took an in-depth look at the three main characters of the story, and now we'll see how their personalities play off of each other in the tale's conclusion. So John Claggart, who we've discussed before, finally makes his move against Billy. He's been trying to trap him for a while and causing him all sorts of grief in the meantime, but now he finally goes directly to Captain Vere and levels an accusation against Billy. He says that Billy is trying to foment a mutiny. Now, if this were a different story by a different writer, we might think that we can already anticipate where this is all leading to, right? But perhaps, surprisingly, Captain Vere doesn't seem to buy Claggart's story. Remember that the captain is a well-read, intelligent man, and he's not someone who's going to be easily persuaded into just believing anything. And what especially alerts him to the potential of fraud is that Claggart is too persuasive. He mentions the mutinies that have happened on other ships, and he hints that if the captain doesn't do something, the same might happen on the Bellipotent. And Vere almost takes this as an insult. He sees that Claggart is trying to manipulate him by playing off of his worst fears. But he does have Billy summoned to his cabin anyway, and he tells Claggart to come along as well. He wants to give Billy the chance to face his accuser. Well, this turns out to be a horrible mistake. When Billy hears the charge that's been laid against him by Claggart, he's just shocked. He's stunned at the revelation of Claggart's unwarranted malice and depravity. At the same time, his stutter prevents him from speaking up in his own defense. So, in the panic of the moment, feeling himself attacked but unable to defend himself, Billy lashes out physically. He swings out his arm and punches Claggart right in the head, so hard that the master-at-arms just immediately falls to the cabin floor like a sack of potatoes, dead. Now this is an unexpected turn. The whole build-up, so far, has been toward this confrontation between the innocent, naive Billy and the depraved, deceitful Claggart. But just like that, Claggart's dead. Almost immediately after that, we're given a hint that things are about to get much worse when Captain Vere, who's been watching everything, calls Billy a fated boy. That word, fate, is ominous, especially so in Melville. It's a key word in Moby Dick as well, and it functions in the same type of way. Billy's destiny, with this action that he's taken, has been sealed. His fate has found him, even though for the moment he's still alive, but it's just only for a matter of time. The conflict of the story quickly changes from Billy versus Claggart to an internal conflict shared by Captain Vere and the other officers that make up part of this impromptu court in the cabin. It's obvious that everybody sympathizes with Billy. It's obvious that Claggart's end is somewhat justified, brought about by his own doing and his own schemes. But another thing that's equally obvious is what martial law, demands, which is Billy's death by hanging for killing an officer. And at this point, Captain Vere does his best to persuade the other officers that Billy has to die. He says, I'll go ahead and just read a little bit of what he says. He says, "Come now, are you thinking something like this?" Speaking to the other officers in the room. "If, mindless of palliating circumstances, we are bound to regard the death of the master-at-arms as the prisoner's deed, then does that deed constitute a capital crime whereof the penalty is a mortal one? But in natural justice is nothing but the prisoner's overt act to be considered? How can we adjure that to summary and shameful death a fellow creature innocent before God, and whom we feel to be so? Does that state it aright? You sign sad assent. Well, I too feel that, the full force of that. It is nature. But do these buttons that we wear attest that our allegiance is to nature? No, to the king. Though the ocean, which is inviolate nature primeval, though this be the element where we move and have our being as sailors, yet as the king's officers lies our duty in a sphere correspondingly natural. So little is that true that in receiving our commissions we in the most important regards ceased to be natural free agents. When war is declared, are we the commissioned fighters previously consulted? We fight at command. If our judgments approve the war, that is but coincidence. So in other particulars, so now. So this is a speech that's merciless in its logic, that's terrifying in its consequences. Fear basically acknowledges that Billy may be innocent before God. He may be innocent according to the laws of human compassion and nature and sympathy, but he's not innocent before the laws of the British Crown in wartime, and that trumps everything. Fear says that really they've lost the ability, or they forfeited the ability to judge the matter as free-thinking agents once they signed up for the military, once they're wearing these badges. He says our obedience is to the law, not to our own morality. So not only is Billy condemned to hang for the law in principle, Captain Vere then goes on and he draws an image of what will happen if they flaunt the law and show him clemency. Remember the context of this story. Everyone is afraid of a mutiny. Everyone is afraid that the anarchy of the French Revolution is going to spread to all of the other kingdoms. Vere says that if they pardon Billy, the other sailors will get the idea that they can then flaunt the law and flaunt order and get away with it as well. So in order to maintain peace on board the ship and in the Navy, the law must be upheld at all costs. And this is a very utilitarian argument. As we talked about last week, utilitarianism was a philosophy espoused by thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, which argued that the basis for all of our actions should be a calculation as to whether or not we would be doing the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people or not. Utilitarianism has often been described as moral arithmetic, as if the decision between right and wrong were simply an equation into which we could insert the greatest happiness principle or the greatest good principle. And we know that Melville had the utilitarians in mind while writing this story because he mentions them briefly back in a previous chapter when he's off on a tangent about Admiral Nelson, who was a real historical figure, and how that officer was considered to have needlessly put himself in harm's way, according, he says, to the Benthamites. The Benthamites, named after Jeremy Bentham, were a name for the utilitarian philosophers who followed Jeremy Bentham's thinking. So Melville was aware of them. And according to a utilitarian, Captain Vere is making the right choice here. If Billy is pardoned, greater harm or misery will ensue. So to preserve the peace, to preserve the greater happiness for the greater number of people, meaning the crew and then by extension the Navy, it's just or right for one man to be hanged, even if that one man is perceived to be innocent due to extenuating circumstances. I think it's clear from the text that the narrator, and by extension Melville, doesn't agree with this sort of philosophy. His sympathies clearly lie with Billy. We get several chapters detailing his last evening alive. And through the whole ordeal, Billy still doesn't complain. He doesn't rant or rail at all. He doesn't seem to harbor any ill feelings at all towards Captain Vere. As a matter of fact, his last words before he's hung from the yardarm are, "God bless Captain Vere." So to the very end, he maintains his happy-go-lucky, carefree attitude that had made him such a favorite with all of his companions on the warship and on the merchant ship before that. Two interesting things happen once Billy is hanged. One, the crew notices that, unlike most people who are hanged, Billy doesn't thrash or jerk around as the life is choked out of him. He doesn't kick his legs or flail. It's like the life leaves him the instant he steps off the top of the yardarm, and he just hangs there limp. The crew speculate as to why this is, but I think that whatever scientific reason there may be for it, the reason thematically, the reason it fits well with the story, is probably to once again highlight Billy's compliance and his easygoing nature. Even in death, he takes all things as they come without complaining. Back at the beginning of the story, we saw him impressed onto a warship, and he goes, okay, and takes off without making a fuss. And here at the end, we see him sentenced to death, and he goes, okay, and that's that. That's not to say he was okay with dying. He seems to go through some sort of mental or spiritual crisis, but his body reflects that kind of carefree attitude and the fact that it doesn't thrash and kick. It just hangs there. Another thing that happens is that the crisis, which Captain Veer is hoping to avoid, almost happens anyway. There seems to be a moment when all of the other sailors, right after Billy is hung, they start to murmur, and it's almost like a riot is about to break out on deck. We read this. An uncertain movement began among them, in which some encroachment was made. It was tolerated but for a moment, for suddenly the drum beat to quarters, which familiar sound happening at least twice every day had upon the present occasion a signal peremptoriness in it. True martial discipline, long continued, superinduces an average man a sort of impulse, whose operation at the official word of command much resembles in its promptitude the effect of an instinct. So the only thing, in the end, that prevents a mutiny is discipline and routine. These sailors have been drilled to follow the orders and to follow the different signals for what they're supposed to do, so much that it's almost an instinct now to obey them. They're starting to murmur, starting to get antsy. They hear a drum that's calling them to the positions, and order is immediately restored. And even if the sailors cared for Billy Budd, they go about their business because it's just become second nature. It's just become habit. I think that there are actually a number of different ways that we can read this ending and think about Billy Budd in general. Thinking of Billy Budd as a sort of noble savage, which we've talked about before, we can read the ending as the innocent child of nature being sacrificed to the rituals and rules of civilization. Billy was too innocent, too naive to move amongst society in wartime. And several other novels from the 19th century share this theme, actually. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein depicts a creature who, like Billy, begins innocent. He's kind of a noble savage. But then, as he's rejected by the villagers he encounters and by Victor Frankenstein himself, the creature falls into despair and resentment and rage. He becomes the monster that society always wanted him to be. Another novel that shares this theme is Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Idiot, where the main character, Prince Mishkin, is depicted as a sort of saintly, holy fool, who eventually suffers a mental breakdown after living amongst the corrupt, wicked, and duplicitous members of society in Tsarist Russia. So, literature in the 19th century was very interested in the man versus society conflict, and seeing how society either destroyed or corrupted those with more gifted or innocent natures. So, that's one way to interpret this story. We can also think about reading it in a biblical light. Keep in mind that Billy Budd was compared to Adam before the fall over and over again by the narrator. John Claggart can even be seen as something of a serpent in the garden, with his sweet voice and silver tongue. Well, Billy transgresses, and the law comes down on him just as swiftly and inexorably as it did on Adam. The punishment for sin is death. The law doesn't show mercy. That's not its job. It's Christ who comes to fulfill the law who can show mercy, but in Billy Budd there isn't a corresponding Christ figure. Billy is left to the mercy of the rigors of the law of sin and death, in a similar way that Adam was in the Old Testament. Now, I'm sure that there are many other ways to interpret this story. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to think about it. These were just the ideas that I got from it while I was reading, and I thought that they'd be worth sharing with you. So, for the next time, we're going to be moving away from Herman Melville, and we'll be reading two authors next week, Washington Irving and Edgar Allan Poe. So be sure to check the syllabus to see which of their short stories we'll be going over, and we'll discuss them then. Thanks.